Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. It's really good to see you. Okay, how many recording devices can we fit onto one lectern? Let's have a competition and see if the Guinness World Book of Records would be interested. I'm really excited to teach 2 Corinthians and some of the background to it for you today. I do also want to welcome the Ferreiras up from Bristol. I saw them somewhere. Where are you? All the way from Bristol. Some people have come. So thank you so much for being with us. And if you are from even further away than Bristol, then may the Lord be with you. But it's exciting to talk about 2 Corinthians today. It is so exciting. 2 Corinthians might be, of all the books of the Bible, the book that has some of the best known quotes, but that is least read and least studied, in my opinion. Some of the quotes that you will know from this book: the God of all comfort. We love that. It comforts us in all our trials, troubles, and so on. The aroma that brings death, the aroma that brings life. The letter from Christ written on hearts and on tablets, being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory. And the church said, Amen. That's a great verse, isn't it? What a great promise. We have this treasure in jars of clay. And we have mobile phones that we perhaps could silence. For Christ's love compels us. We're Christ's ambassadors. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. Godly sorrow brings repentance that leads to salvation. God loves a cheerful giver. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. When I am weak, then I am, including my voice this morning. There's some famous quotes there, right? Verses we all know, and I would guess some of us would know they're from 2 Corinthians. Some of the rest of us would be like, I know that verse, I've heard that quote, it's somewhere, it's in the New Testament. I think Paul might have written it. It's a wonderful book, 2 Corinthians. What a shame it is that it is often so neglected. And I hope that not only today, but through October and November, as we study it as a church, that we'll come to be enthralled by the book. We'll come to love it. We'll come to appreciate it. And I pray that it will begin a lifelong relationship with the book of 2 Corinthians. It's one that we'll always go back to. One of my personal dreams for these teaching days and these teaching series that we've now done for the last 4 years in London is that what they do is, amongst other things, is that it means that when we go back and read the book that we've studied, we never read it quite the same way again. We bring back to it all of what we've learned at a teaching day or through the teaching series, and each time we open it, it's richer, it's deeper, it's got more colour, it's got more definition, and it's more meaningful to us in our personal lives. And so I pray and I hope that today this will happen for us as we look at this sadly neglected book of 2 Corinthians. Now our theme for the day is treasure in jars of clay. Treasure in jars of clay, a passage that we will look at a bit later. Where are we? We're in Corinth. You have a photograph there of the Temple of Apollo, one of the oldest stone temples in the whole of Greece. The Temple of Apollo was completed in 550 BC. That thing has been standing, those columns have been standing 2,500 years. Wow. We're dealing with a city with a long and varied history. Of those columns, not so many, of the original 38 columns, only 7 survive. And part of that is to do with the ravages of time. And part of it is to do with the fact that the city of Corinth, though it had been in existence many centuries, was completely destroyed in 146 BC. Roman armies came, and it was a rebellious city, and they leveled it. and it was not inhabited for another 100 years. It was a kind of rule in the Roman Empire that if you destroyed a city because of its rebellion, it had to remain empty for 100 years. You couldn't rebuild it. And so some generations had to go by before you could rebuild. And so 100 years or so later, it was re-established, and we'll talk more about that, about this amazing city and why Paul went there. But what we have is not columns of marble. We're talking today about clay jars. Ordinary clay vessels. That is the Apostle Paul, the Corinthians at that time, and even us here today. We're just clay. Isn't that true? You know, dust to dust and all that. Most of us live in the main part of London. There's a lot of London clay. And it's not particularly attractive. I don't know how many of you are gardeners. My wife and I like to do a bit of gardening. And when we lived in Harrow until recently, gardening in the garden, it was hard work digging in our garden. The clay is not attractive. It's sticky, it sticks to your spade, it sticks to your hand, it sticks to your boots, and it's jolly hard work. We've now moved to Croxley Green, where all things are green, and all things are beautiful, and you're welcome to join us there in God's good green land of Croxley. And but there, we're outside of the London clay. It's all soft, loamy soil. You dig into it and the dirt falls off the spade. It's wonderful. Clay isn't very attractive. We're just clay. But there's a but. We are clay, but we have a treasure. We have a treasure, and indeed God, in a sense, has treasure in us, in these jars. And what will we do with that treasure? What will God make of that treasure? What can he do with it? And that's what we'll talk about today. Three parts to our time here today. First of all, we'll be talking about the Corinthian clay. What made up those Corinthians and what was their situation. Secondly, we'll talk about the Pauline jar, not the Pauline jar, the Pauline jar. And then finally, we'll talk about the divine treasure. The divine treasure. As we look into what it means to be jars of clay holding this amazing treasure. So first of all, let's talk about the Corinthian clay. Where are we in the Mediterranean? Well, we are in Corinth, in the Mediterranean area. In the context of the Mediterranean, it's not terribly clear, but Corinth is there for those of you with good eyesight. The rest of you need to go to Specsavers and other opticians outlets are available. In the Aegean Sea context, there you have Corinth opposite Ephesus, where Paul, of course, spent 3 years and a lot of time and effort. Very near the city of Athens. Athens was the more prestigious city in terms of its intellectual background, but Corinth was a very different city, which we'll talk about. There it is in its Achaean context. It's a port city, which it is a very important part of its heritage and its makeup. It's a very ancient city, and the monuments and ruins are still there today if you ever have a chance to visit. What kind of place was it? Well, Corinth was essentially a very wealthy place. I mean, if you were a resident of Corinth, unless you were a slave, but if you weren't a slave, you were in a great place in life financially. You were almost certainly doing well. It was a wealthy place. Because of its port location, a lot of port cities are particularly wealthy, and here we are in London, and because the Ferrera is up from the Bristol area, very rich cities in their time. Port cities tend to be wealthy because of the taxes they can levy on the goods being brought in, and even if the goods don't stay there. And here you have a picture of a paved causeway, because there was where Corinth was situated. Going back to this picture, you can see that it's between two bodies of water, two sides of that spot there, and it was a long way round. To go round the southern tip was a 200-mile dangerous trip in a boat. And of course, boats in those days were even more dangerous than they are today. It's very sad to hear about the sinking of a ship just off Italy, and the hundreds dead there. sadly, the numbers may not have been as great, but the occasions of boats sinking and ships sinking in those days was very common. And so if you could avoid going on a dangerous sea trip, you would. And so sometimes what they would do is the sea captains would pull their boats up on shore to this point here, this paved causeway coming out of the sea. And if the boat could be, it would be pulled out, dragged along a paved causeway that went all the way across from one side to the other. It was just a few miles. And if your boat wasn't too heavy, they would drag it or put it on rollers, and it was quicker and safer to drag your ship all the way across than to send it around the southern route. A couple of sayings from that period. If you were going round the southern route, they used to say, "May he who sails round Mallia," that's the southern route, "forget his home." Why? Because it would take such a long time to go around that way. Or another saying of the time was, "May he who sails round Mallia first make his will." Because it was a dangerous journey. And I would advise all of us to make your will, because you never know when the end may come, especially if you ride a motorbike. But that's another story, and I have no particular point to make about that, except to make your will. So, anyway, this is now the Corinthian Canal. It was begun in the days of Nero. They started it in 64 AD or something like that, I think in the 60s. There have been earlier attempts even than that, but they finally finished it in 1893. So that's a long project. It took a while to get that sorted out, but they did eventually cut this canal, which is 75 feet wide, and now ships go that way. What kind of place was it? It was wealthy. This was a well-to-do place. What kind of place? It was energetic. This is a fast-paced city. This is very like London in so many respects. Maybe not Croxley Green, but definitely most of London. It's an energetic place. It was destroyed in 146 BC, as we talked about. It was resettled in 44 BC, which means that by the time Paul is there, it's about 100 years old. It's a young city. And you know what happens with young cities? They tend to be a bit more energetic. Perhaps partly because they're less secure. You know, we don't have much history, and there's a lot of energy there. There's only been 2, 3, 4, maybe generations of people living there. They have a very open mind about their future and where they're going. The people that resettled the place were mostly freedmen and freedwomen. So they were former slaves, and they'd been freed at some point, and they were sort of, I was going to say bussed in, but I guess they didn't have buses. But you know, they were sent in, they were brought in to Corinth, and they settled this place. And so they are people who've won their freedom, bought their freedom, earned their freedom. They tend to be people that would have a lot of self-motivation. They would be your entrepreneurial people. They would be independent people. I won my freedom. I was a slave, and I bought myself out. I earned my way out. I had such good behavior that my master said, "You can have your freedom. I am a self-made man, a self-made woman. I know how to handle myself." Do you think that might play into some of the issues in 1 Corinthians? Do you think that might have some relevance even to our culture? Very confident of their ability to look after themselves. And you know, if there's a problem between me and you, then let's get a lawyer. That would be the way they would deal with disputes. And again, we see some of that in 1 Corinthians. They had the Isthmian Games there, very similar to the Olympic Games, held every 2 years rather than every 4 years. So lots of things going on. What kind of place was it? Wealthy, energetic, and diverse. The people that were brought into Corinth in 40-odd BC when it was refounded were from all over the Mediterranean and the Roman Empire. They weren't just people from Rome. There were people from Syria, people from North Africa, and quite a contingent of Jewish people that were brought in. Very diverse. You walk down the streets of Rome and you see mostly Romans, you see mostly Latin people in that sense. You walk down the streets of Corinth and you'd see people from all over, effectively the known world at its time. So a very diverse place. Very much like London, isn't it? Yeah. You walk down most of the streets in London and you're not going to see one type of person from one background or one culture. You're going to be confused by all the different kinds of people that you see. That's what Corinth was like. What else was it like? It was morally lax. It was the kind of place where pretty much anything goes. It was allowed. What were the reasons for that? Well, partly I think it's to do with the fact that it was a port city. Port cities tend to have that kind of reputation. You think of London itself, perhaps New York, Amsterdam, liberal places where there's a stretching of what would be allowed. I worked on a ship once back in 1980, not the 1950s. In 1980, which is long enough ago as it is. I worked for 2 months on a ship, and it was a very interesting experience. I've never had anything like it before or since. And the morals, there weren't any morals on board. You know the sort of thing they talk about, like when bands go on tour.
Yeah.
What goes on tour stays on tour. And you know what happens on a tour. Complete the phrase. Anyway, stays on tour. It's a different world, and it's like that on a ship. And any of the rest of you ever worked on a ship? Yeah? Oh, because Corey has, that's right. I don't know about submarines in the US Navy. I don't know. But it's like you're in a different world. Whatever happens there, it has no relevance to real life. And there was all kinds of sin and behavior going on that ship, some of which I indulged in, that you wouldn't do that. I would never have done that back on land, or back in my normal environment. So part of it is to do with the fact that it's a port city. There are lots of sailors there, and lots of people interacting with them, people passing through, a lot of transient people passing through. You tend to feel, if you're not rooted there, that you can get away with things because you're leaving it behind. The term Corinthian was used in Roman times to refer to somebody of loose morals. You say, oh, well, she's a Corinthian, he's a Corinthian. That's what you'd say. There were around 1,000 temple prostitutes in the city. Now the city, I've seen various estimates of the population of Corinth at the time of Paul, but it was probably at least 400,000. So that's one prostitute for every 400 people in the city. That sounds like a lot to me. I mean, I don't know what a lot is, but I don't know, but it sounds like a lot. You used those temple prostitutes when you went to make your offerings at the shrines and the temples within the city. So that's the kind of thing. One of a Greek poet called Crinagoras, when he saw the kind of people they were using to resettle Corinth in the 40s BC, he was dismayed at the kind of moral quality of these people that were being brought in to resettle it. And he said this, what inhabitants, O luckless city, hast thou received? And in place of whom? Alas, for the great calamity of Greece, wholly abandoned to such a crowd of scoundrelly slaves. Scoundrelly slaves. That's the kind of person that refounded Corinth. And it's the children of those people, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, that Paul is encountering in his mission there and in the letters that we're dealing with. So Corinth, what a complex, exciting, but scary place at the same time. Very like London, like most large cities perhaps. Now, let's talk about the Corinthian church timeline. Now we looked at the city and its background. Let's talk about what happened in its church life. And here are a few pointers which I hope will be clear enough on the screen. This presentation, by the way, will go onto the London website, so you'll be able to download it at a later time if you wish. So what have we got on my screen there? We got the direction of travel, a visit from one side to the other. There was a lot of traveling between Paul and Titus and Timothy and the Corinthians, and people from Corinth also visiting or talking to Paul. At the beginning there, on the far left, so the bottom, is, if you like, the Corinthian church timeline, going from about 50 AD to about 57 AD. That's the period I'm looking at right now, those 7 years. And so then you have various scriptures, and you have the direction of travel, and a few other things I'll explain. So on the far left, first of all, you have Paul, from the top there, going to Corinth. And he starts the church in Corinth in Acts chapter 18. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. How long did he stay there? Acts 18 verse 11 says he stayed there for about a year and a half. So that's quite a while. He's had long enough to teach, instruct, raise up disciples, raise up leadership. I mean, he's done a lot of work there in Corinth. Then he goes off and carries on his second missionary journey. And then what happens next is that Paul writes a letter to the Corinthians. And you've got a picture of a manuscript there with a lost stamped across it. Because we don't have that letter. We don't have it, at least not at this point. Who knows if it would ever turn up? I somewhat doubt it, but you never know. But it was written and lost. He mentions this in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 9, where he says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. So he refers back to a letter in 1 Corinthians. He says, you remember that other letter I wrote to you earlier? So there's a letter that was written earlier. After that, it seems that the Corinthians write to Paul, as well as Chloe, or people from her household, visit Paul. Perhaps they brought the letter from the Corinthians. It seems that letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians was to help them with some issues, but they misunderstood some things about associating with pagans or not, and that kind of thing. And so they wrote back and said, we've got some questions of our own. They wrote back a letter, but also Chloe or people from her household said, there are some issues in Corinth that you need to deal with. We need some help. And so that's what prompted the writing of 1 Corinthians. So Paul writes 1 Corinthians. He sends it, I think, with Timothy. There's a reference to a visit by Timothy in 1 Corinthians 4:17, where Paul says, for this reason I have sent to you Timothy, my son, whom I love, who is faithful in the Lord. Look after him, treat him well. It seems that the letter goes with Timothy. It goes with Timothy. He takes the letter, but, sad face, it doesn't seem like the letter is very well received. Not only is it not well received, but they also, again, misunderstand some of his instructions about dealing with a man who has been incestuous and similar other issues. So, unfortunately, Timothy comes back to Paul and says, you know that letter you wrote? I think it was awesome. But the Corinthians, they got the wrong end of the stick. So, I think we need to do something about it. And so then next what happens is that Paul says, you know what? I love those Corinthians. I'm going to go and pay them a visit. I've written them a letter. It didn't quite work well. If I go, surely I'll be able to explain things face to face. And so he decides to go. That's referred to in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 1. Paul himself mentions the fact